Welcome to No Effing Idea, the podcast where two battle-tested insiders cut through the noise about enterprise AI. Some straight talk about what AI really means for organizations trying to transform, both from strategy and technology angles. David Royal is the founder of Tanhill.ai, an AI strategy and deployment firm for mid-sized and specialist firms. And prior to that, led many enterprises transform at EY, Capgemini, and Grant Thornton. And Srini and co-founded IntelStack, an AI and cloud services firm, and before that, led strategic growth at Capgemini, TCS, and HPE. He also writes the High Stakes Tech Leader newsletter for enterprise leaders. Please welcome your hosts, David and Srini.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever the listeners are. Thank you very much for joining us on the No Effing Idea podcast. We've got Ravi Ramchandran today. Very, very glad to have him. But first of all, I must start by thanking both of you, David and Ravi, for recording this on a Sunday. Just goes to show how much charm and charisma I have to get both of you on a Sunday afternoon. So thank you very much again, and I'm so delighted to have Ravi Ramchandran today here on the. And the fantastic thing about him is he's come from the other side of the table, as I call it. Right? He has been on the end user organizations, Walmart, healthcare, retail, and then now he is coming to Microsoft to do a lot of the AI, LLM, and all the nice stuff he's going to talk about. That's what we'll do. We'll probably spend the most part of today's conversation quizzing Ravi about how we can actually build agents for work, right? There's a lot of hype around that, and I want Ravi to really chip in and say, look, this is doable. He's got a unique perspective on this, but I want to steal his thunder. Ravi, quick intro.
So I think Srini already introduced what I do for a living, but basically I'm an AI tinkerer, and a lot of it is like self-made and then graduated to have like a very good theoretical foundation. I did my master's from Liverpool University just recently, by the way, and then a lot of thesis involved to understand what GPT is. And my main passion is basically helping the world to make better use of AI and then help them become better and then make the world a better place. That doesn't explain my day job, which basically is around taking a lot of LLMs which are there, the OpenAI, the Anthropic, and then we launched them on Azure. Before that, I built ML platforms for Walmart, did a bunch of stuff on healthcare, again on platforms. Been a platforms guy for a lot of my entire career, which, as David said, just makes me realize 2 decades in the industry is quite some time, right, David? So I think I'm very excited to come on this podcast, and then the topic is very interesting, so we can dive right into it, Srini.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you. Before we do that, I'm always curious to know what you think, both of you, what you think about what's happening in the last 7, 8, 10 days. And 7 days can be a very long time in the life and times of AI. Think of it Srini, or think of it in terms of whatever else is happening. Maybe David, can I ask you what's kind of caught your attention? Quirky, interesting, serious? What 2 or 3 things that you picked up as something that is worth talking, bringing to the attention of our listeners?
Well, I'll let you guys talk a little bit more about the Indian summit because you're probably closer than I am on it. But obviously that was a significant event and laid open some of the political challenges within the big players therein. I mean, from a tool perspective, I think Nano Banana 2 coming out was significant. I mean, it was extraordinary the first time round and it's better still. So that's all very exciting. I mean, I think more generally and at a more macro level, I think there is increasing amounts of concern about where AI is going and the controls and the implications on society. You shared with me some recent research, Srini, which was a fascinating read, sort of really laying out sort of how this could manifest itself in terms of economic implications and how this could be very much an accelerating challenge with AI, not only actually, as we get more productive, people invariably laid off, but then the actual disposable income goes down and therefore economies are impacted. So I think that's quite challenging perspectives. So as ever, it's that double-edged sword of excitement coupled with anxiety about how this manifests itself.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I had to literally put down the Citrini research after reading it and really take 2 minutes to really think. This doesn't look impossible. And that was my first conclusion. This looks very much possible. At which I will turn to Ravi and say, what was your sense from a practitioner? What did you think of Citrini and everything else?
Well, I think I looked at Citrini and then OpenClaw. That
Well, of
was
course.
the other big thing that came in, right? It's like, hey, Citrini is saying that this is what's going to happen. A lot of it did seem like, so from an S-curve perspective, it is still more in terms of, there is like a hype around the S-curve, which is there, and then how it's going to balance out. The last part did say it's a bit speculative. I am like, okay, let's see where this lands, right? But then OpenClaw also came in, and then OpenClaw was like the other big thing that happened from a text perspective. So you have an agent which runs and does things for you, and then it sounded very close to what Citrini had predicted till it started making things up for its own. So yeah, a lot of good developments, a lot of hype around that, and I think that's where we are, right? Like dispelling the hype around AI. Right? That's what all this is all about. So just thinking how we should look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, I think the other realism that one news item really brought up, it's not the last 7 days, maybe the last 2 weeks, was the fact that the GDP figures are actually being measured for AI productivity. And if I am not wrong, they're talking about attributing 2% upwards productivity in the US. And it's from a reputable outlet, Financial Times, saying that this is the kind of productivity uplift that is becoming visible. I don't have the exact numbers to hand, but that is something that is positive in a way that all of this hype and all this capex that going into all of the, whatever data centers, GPUs, and everything else, that is all leading up to finally something that enterprises want, individuals want, etc. But there's a lot of fraud still, a lot of fraud still.
Oh yeah. I would definitely agree to that. So it'll take some time for all this to kind of land, and we kind of in the near term, I always say, right, there's going to be choppy waters.
Yeah.
A lot of choppy waters.
And I've seen some quite reassuring reports at a corporate level that actually sort of the layoffs haven't manifested themselves, and actually I think there's a term, Parkinson's law, where something fits the space that's created for it. And actually one of the big national banks in the UK, Lloyds Banking Group, have I think 800 agents operational, and they haven't had significant layoffs, and those people have been redeployed doing different activity. And that gives some hope, I think, that actually maybe the research may not manifest itself, and actually it could be a very positive story and a real productivity lift. This is how we navigate this journey, isn't it?
Yep. And then Block came in, which said 50% layoffs again. So then the news around AI is always like there's one part of the spectrum which always says, hey, nothing is going to change. It's just a new way of work. And there's one other part which says that everything is going to change and use like doomsday, right? So the saner voices are somewhere lost. But what really happens, right? What makes news is like extremes, right? So we don't know how it's going to land, but I don't think it's like time to choose either this or that, right? We still need to have some time and then realize what it's worth, right? So that's precisely what I'm going to do, at least for the next couple of years.
My thinking is, to David's point, organizations like NatWest, Lloyds, large banks, traditional banks, establishment banks, those have so much of backlog and so much of tech debt and so much of work to be done still that they can only do with AI, right? More responsible, explainable AI. And if that is there, then there is no reason why established enterprises will kind of use this as a kind of tailwind to do more work done. Now, the other theory is that the likes of Block or ServiceNows or the SaaS apocalypse or whatever they're calling it, that is a kind of interim phenomenon, I feel, because they are trying to see if they can eat their own pill and try and become effective in being able to serve the customers, because they are not the end customers themselves, as against a Walmart or a NatWest, right? So I think there's a bit of a divergence there, but to be correct, the likes of Block, if they can do this without so many people, then it's okay. But eventually, as you said, Ravi, the efficiencies and the productivity will have to kick in, and that has to justify what we are saying. Yeah. Anything else you guys picked up as kind of something to track for March or anything else?
I think one more thing was the launch of Open Computer, right? So that's what Perplexity launched, and then it's basically OpenClaw on steroids. It sits on a computer, and then that gives like a sandbox environment. So a large part of a lot of these workloads are not secure by default, right? So we hear these news about, hey, Claude deleted my entire secure repository and stuff like that, right? So sandbox environments. So the entire infrastructure around building a lot of these things is also kind of developing much, much faster than where we think, right? Which is absolutely how it should be, right? So on your point, Srini, very much close to the entire cloud world as well, right? So when cloud evolution really started, there are like old world companies, generation companies who are like slower for adoption. And Amazon versus Walmart comes to me at that mind. Right? Amazon tech first, digital first, all native, and then they create web services, right? But Walmart is still there, and then they're doing pretty well, and then they have found out how AI, how cloud works for them, right? So I think if we have the right structure, and that's where a lot of the way David said earlier, right? So a lot of the structure around how AI works for every company and every generation company, and that's basically the framework that leaders need to articulate better, right? So there are like psychological safeguards, there are like organizational safeguards for everything that need to be done, and only then it's probably going to be successful for that organization. AI should be working for that organization to make it more successful, right? So that's the mindset that will probably land in a couple of years, hopefully. Till that time, you just sit in the ship and enjoy the rocky ride, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think the adoption will lag the development that's coming out from the likes of the big tech companies, but that's kind of expected, isn't it? I mean, enterprises are a different beast altogether, as we all know. One particular concern, and I think this kind of goes into the theme that we are going to talk about, is the younger employees. And this is something David and I have talked about in the past episodes as well. The younger employees, the grad level people, the younger junior employees, etc., they need a hook to come into an enterprise and then rise up the career, etc., and do things. But that's the slowdown that's happened. And I think that's something that you will cover today. I think building agents for work inside, outside, as a kind of budding entrepreneur, can you do something which you don't necessarily look for employment to take off? I think those are some of the things that your session today will shed a lot of light on. Maybe a quick intro on why you picked up this particular subject, Ravi, and then you're coming at it in a different way. You're not saying let's build agents for the fun of it. You're saying something else. You're saying come backwards.
Yeah, I think we need to redefine, right? So being in software for 2 decades, right? Every 8 years, I have seen that the way of work changes significantly enough for us to change and relearn what we are doing, right? So I think the third wave or the fourth wave, right? So initially, I can definitely talk about the cloud, the ML wave, and then the AI wave, and the entire data wave which was there. I have seen 4 of these already, and then there was the web wave, the Web 2.0 wave. So then this is the sixth wave that we are probably seeing. So there has been a lot of relearning at every wave, right? So this is the next wave for me, right? So if you take your entire workday into like, let's say 3 parts where you're doing like experimenting, where you're doing like some kind of validations, and then where you're doing a lot of engineering, that entire mix is probably going to change a lot, right? When I say engineering, I mean the entire things around engineering, which means that you're kind of writing something, breaking something, connecting something, then explaining something, pitching something and stuff like that, right? So the mix of what you're going to do is kind of going to change, right? So now if I say that a lot of work that you're going to do is probably going to be done better by AI, then you better learn, you should have a way in which foundationally you can change what can be done with AI and then delegate that to AI so that you have more time on your hands. And then you're looking at problems which then merit, or the newer problems which come in. We talked about that earlier, right? Like compliance, psychological safety barriers, responsible AI. So a lot of those things, right? So where do you find time to tackle those problems, and where's that mind share? So the goal is basically to, redefine, and I have this 70-20-10 principle, which is there. It says that 70% of your work is basically like the routine work, which is there, and how you can make that 70% basically like 50, and then give time more to that 20 and 10, right? And then increase that barrier for the next couple of years. So that's basically where practical agents come in.
How do you structure the 20 and 10? You talked about 70 reduction, I mean reducing it, optimizing it, but the 20-10 buckets, how would you describe them?
So 20 is basically experimental. And then the 10 is basically the entire vision around it, right? So you envision something for sense. So then it is very different. So again, you have to look at where you are, right? So as you said, if I am like in AstraZeneca, then probably I'm not doing that. I'm 2010 is a good number. But if I'm in a digital native company, right? So maybe that 20 is already 30 or 40, right? Because then a lot of it is already automated. So sit in whatever space you are, right? If you are in consulting, engineering, or wherever you are, sit in that space and then define, okay, what is my mix? 70-20-10 or 50-50, or is it like 50-40-10? And then say, okay, of the 50 that I'm doing a lot of the routine work, can I go ahead and make that like 40 or 30, right? So that I have more time for that, because that is what AI is probably not going to solve for you. A lot of that, the other part is already solved by AI. And if you dedicate that 40, if you make that experimental work that you're doing like larger, only then you can make that routine work smaller, right? So that's basically the chicken and egg problem, which we are facing.
Which is so true, because I was looking at bank's situation and, the whole run the bank, which I'm sure David will recognize, run the bank and change the bank, right? I mean, the standard framing of tech spend in banks is just on those two buckets. We wish it was as simple as that. It's much more nuanced and the spectrum is wide. And we want to do less of RTB, a bit like the 70% that you referred to, but we cannot avoid doing some of those. And the ones that we can't avoid, that if we can agentify in a secure way, then why not? And, the whole business about having everything revolve around human friction, to some extent it's fine, but you don't need to have that. So before you come in, Ravi, on that, David, any thoughts on the human friction element that's being attacked, the 70-20-10 that Ravi is talking about?
I had a conversation with a global transformation leader for one of the big four banks this week, and she was fresh out of 2 days of an AI workshop, but was lamenting the fact that there's just so much activity going on within her team that she doesn't really know how to control it. She doesn't know if people are doing things sensibly. She's worried about the quality of what's being produced, particularly when you've got AI within software development. Be confident about actually the quality of what's being produced, and also the costs of the calls, etc. So that was the human aspect for me, is that whilst this experimental aspect is being encouraged, there's also a control aspect, which is really challenging, because particularly in big banks and other organizations where there's a very high caliber of people, they're all playing and
Yes.
they're all doing things. And so how do you manage that? It's an extraordinary period of time.
No, so correct. So, kind of coming back to you, Ravi, the whole aspect of attacking the 70, and the 70 also has elements of routineness, monotony, that kind of activities, which is so. I have done weekly reports myself in my career in the past, and I used to dread and hate them. And the whole thing used to work. I won't name the name of the company that I used to go through this with. But my team will send me weekly reports. I'm supposed to look at them and then add mine and compile and send it upwards. And then that guy will combine from his team all the way to CEO. And I thought, this is such an exercise of futility, that why can't we just create something in a website and everybody puts it in or something like that? But so I think, take us through, Ravi, your thoughts on how to, to use the word bloody agentify this thing, right? So get rid of this.
So fundamentally, Srini, you put it very humorously, but it's such a pain, right? Like, so
It is.
the other big change which has come in, and I can see that I'm sitting right in the middle of it. Innovation was a function, right? So if you go to a large established company, you say, hey, you have an innovation council, you have this innovation charter, you have somebody who's like budgeted for innovation, somebody else's job to do innovation, and then there are people who are sitting there who are saying that, okay, my job is to do innovation, so let me do innovation around it, and let me hire a few consultants, and let's make things happen. And then that the CEO has tasked those guys to change, and the others really don't care. The fundamental shift that's really happened now is that like innovation becomes everybody's business, because the barrier for innovation has drastically reduced. So day in and day out, you're going to see somebody who's kind of, hey, I made this app. I was talking to a guy, ex-Amazon, true story. He left his job, used Cloud Code, and built something on astrology. We should have him on this podcast. We'll discuss that later, Srini, but amazingly done. One person. So that's what we call barriers breaking. So people don't understand, right? So people are so much worried about either doomsday or they're worried about things changing or being the same that they have forgotten how to value what you have presently, right? And this is one fundamental change, which is like on first principles has come in already and is sitting right in front of you. The barrier for innovation has now gone very low. Everybody can sit and do innovation. So when innovation becomes everybody's business, you really need to make sure that, you use those tools for what they are meant to do. And if I just give you a tool, right? So I did a survey for a lot of organizations. Like last week, I was there in one of those seminars. Many folks came in. A simple show of hands, right? How many of you have got tools, right? So these are all corporate tools, right? How many of you have got Copilot, right? 90% up. How many of you have systems and engineering practices which have changed to accommodate Copilot? Only 10%, only 20%, right? So organizations tend to think that if I give you a tool, but I don't and you will find out a way to do work with that tool and become like 30%, 40% more productive, which is so much far from the tool. All successful organizations, there's an excellent paper of the changes which are done by Shopify, where they said that I'm going to change my engineering structure in such a way that, the tools become effective for the organization, which is basically three areas, right? One, create a psychological safety barrier. Second, integrate each of the tools within your organization so that they become AI native. And the third is have a good responsible AI structure in such a way that, if you are doing innovation, you're not kind of hitting those corners where you said, hey, you shouldn't have been playing with this data to make things happen, right? And that's basically the safeguards that require a lot of investment and effort, which people are not doing at this point of time, right? So that's the big challenge.
I agree with your summation there entirely, and particularly I'd like to dig in a little bit on those sort of controls around safe innovation and how do you manage that? Going back to my transformation director saying, I've got all these people doing things. How do you envisage that sort of safe environment to ensure people are doing things appropriately? How is it possible to control things? What do you recommend in that context?
All the organizations that I have seen who have been successful, and we do a lot of studies as well, it's basically if you have written down those principles, right?
A policy.
If you want to, if you just have an innovation council and then they are going to gate everything, then probably you're going to slow yourself and everybody down. That's not going to happen. The second is like AI by default, right? Shopify is this amazing principle where forget his name, I think he's Brian, but he just came in and he said that whenever you come to me for headcount, I'm probably even going to ask, why can't this be done by AI? But in the same breath, he also said that default is yes for any workflow that impacts the customer. So these are like big principles which are there. So a lot of these are like principle framing to be done by the CEO and the CTO level. And then from that principles come out those engineering pillars, right? How AI becomes native to the organizations. It's like people are not like stepping on each other. They are not kind of worried that, okay, if I innovated, am I going to kick myself out of my job, right? I mean, that's the biggest worry that people have. So these are the kind of questions that like the big elephants in the room that nobody is kind of addressing at this point of time, right? And that's where I think a lot of leadership direction is.
Yeah, not true. I think the kind of safe place to experiment and safe place to try out kind of thing is so important. Why don't we do this? Could you spend some time, Ravi, taking us through how actually one could put some of these things into practice? So maybe pick any example that you want, which is right now human friction, maybe something that people don't like doing, but still keeping control of what's coming out, right? So pick anything that you like.
I think let's take simple examples. Right? I think we discussed one of these already, and we love to hate it, status reports, but we know that how important they are for management, right? It's like, hey, so many of us derive a lot of value in terms of metrics from status reports, right? So if we want to do that, right? So let's take like a very practical use case, right? I have my team and then we discuss status every day, right? Like there are sprint. So there are all these choreographed engineering practices like sprint discussions, weekly status meetings and stuff around that. So the thought is if a lot of these are being recorded already, is there a way in which you can probably derive value out of it in such a way that it adds value to management, right? So let's say like status reports, and let's take a very bland use case. I want to send status reports to somebody. So what are the tools that are available? How is it that you can kind of work around it is basically is basically what we can kind of like brainstorm, right? And happy to get ideas from you, Srini and David as well, right? So let me just set the context, right? So let's talk through. So a lot of our meetings, I think, do we have Zoom? I think Zoom records every meeting that is there, right? Microsoft is notorious. We record anything and everything that is there, and we want to play by example. These are all that I'm presenting is basically like fictitious, right? So let's look at some transcripts which are there, right? And then we can bounce through ideas. I should be able to share my screen, I guess. Okay.
So while you
Here
do
we go.
that, while you share the screen, for those of our listeners who are on audio only, they're going to miss out. But when you do talk about it, Ravi, try and describe what you're doing so that while they miss the magic, they can still get a sense of it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good caller, Srini. Let me just talk through that as well. So this is basically audio transcripts, right? So we have this meeting, and then there are folks like Alex and Kevin who have joined, and then they are kind of putting in and talking through stuff that they have on agenda, right? So this is basically the transcript of those meetings, right? So Alex wants to talk about what's happened, and then what's really his focus area is. So these are like sprint meetings which are there. So you talk about yesterday's progress, you talk about what you want to do today, you talk about blockers, asks, and dependencies and metrics, right? So this is like a good summary of on a daily basis that you keep getting as you start talking through meetings, right? Now, the idea is if you're talking about status on these meetings already, you can actually follow through on these, and then you can have a way in which you can take stuff which is already available in repositories, and then the question that I'm going to tackle, and this is one example, right? So can you use all these transcripts to create like status reports that you send out on a weekly and monthly basis? And if you do that, once we do that, we'll probably have a look into what are the guardrails, right? You don't want to send a wrong status. So this is like a tiny example where we are saying that we can send status reports, but what are the guardrails? What could go wrong? What are the things I should take care of? And probably, use that as a starting point to, discuss more in terms of these use cases. So how do we start, right? So what I do have is basically all these archived inside SharePoint already, right? So these are like meeting notes, right? So these are archived in SharePoint and then archived on a daily basis. And everybody is kind of talking through what they are planning to do on a daily basis. And this is now mostly automated, and then you get these from transcripts. So these are not statuses, these are not formatted. And what I need to do is have a way in which I can format them into a way that I can instruct my LLM to derive value out of it, right? Which is where I can start with something which is like pretty damn simple. Just a quick check. I think you're able to see my screen, I guess.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay. So let's go over some of these things. So if I want to do something around that, I need to create an agent, right? So how do I create an agent, right? So let's say plain vanilla, I want to create an agent, right? So let's say I want to create like a weekly status collator, which is there, right? So what I'm going to use is I'm going to use Copilot Studio, which is like the no-code version of that. I can write this entire thing in code. It's hardly going to take like 20, 25 minutes, which is one way to do that. The other way to do that is, use code generators which are already available. So I'm basically using Copilot Studio to go inside and then define what I want to do, right? So the first thing that I do is I can do a lot of things over here, like fancy stuff which are there. But what I'm actually going to do is basically connect it to my SharePoint site, right? So let's probably see whether I have something which I got already connected. So let's open this. So this is basically M365 Copilot, and I can point it to a SharePoint location, and in this SharePoint location, I can then. So this is basically the repository where I have all my meeting transcripts available, and then I'm going to define an agent using no code to do exactly what we want to do, right? Extract daily updates from meeting notes and transcripts.
Ravi, can I just chip in to kind of ask a dumb question? So when you say AI agent, you're basically building what? What is the kind of classic definition of agent in this context?
So an agent is something that does a small piece of what you want to do in a more deterministic and reliable manner. So if you think that we are the brain and the hand is moving based on what the brain is saying, if you can make the hand move based on signals from the brain, right? So the hand is like an agent for the brain, right? So there are stuff that the hand can do, which then adds value to the brain. So the brain is sitting there as system, but an agent is probably going to do something very specific, which cannot be done using code, right? So you could actually code this entire thing out, but then what's going to happen is the format is going to change, right? So think about, I love drinking caffeine, so I have this glass with me, and then I have programmed to my robot to come in and pick this glass and then always take it towards my mouth and drink it, right? But tomorrow, what's going to happen is, what if my glass moves here? Then my program is going to say, hey, I can't find the glass anymore. But if you have a hand, a brain analogy which is there, it's going to figure out, oh, I can't see the glass here. Okay, hey, it's here, right? Well, let me take it. Okay, then is the glass broken? No. Can I look inside? Yes, there is caffeine inside it. Okay, let me feed it and let me get better again, right? So basically, a lot of thinking that the hand brain connection is going to do is basically how I visualize that agent.
Right. And a quick supplementary on that. Does the agent you visualize in this particular case also do non-deterministic?
Oh yeah. So for example, if a lot of stuff that's there over here, right? If you look at the transcript over here, right? A lot of stuff over here is totally non-deterministic. They are probably going to talk about things which they're probably going to talk about the tea that they had, right? It's not probably going to come in the end. So that is basically the guardrails that you need to put as well, right? So those are some things that probably we'll talk a little bit down later if you have time to figure out like what are guardrails. But as a fact, there are things over here which the agent is probably going to ignore completely, right? Like the first line over here, right?
Yep. Sorry, go back.
So let's see like what we can do with that particular agent, right? What we can do. So there are multiple models also that we can use, but then I've written like a prompt here. This is a no-code platform, so I can easily write a lot of stuff over here. There's an art to writing this as well. So this is basically called prompt engineering, and how you need to do that is also something that is a class in itself. But here is what I have written, right? And not the most perfect way to do that. But then what I said is I given the agent a task, right? You're given one document, you look up, make things happen, you expect a clean, concise daily update. So what I do want is for the agent to be more deterministic and to figure out, test my use cases. I initially want to put down as a JSON. I can then convert it very easily, but then I want to kind of say, this is what I want to extract from the document. And this is all plain English. So I am using a no-code platform. I'm using semantic English to create a weekly status report based on a synopsis of, let us say, 30 or 40 transcripts that I have. And then I'm probably going to do that in like 20 minutes. So to do that, what I need to make sure is like I have written rules, which the agent is definitely going to obey. If any of these, if these are like guardrails. So some of these guardrails are this, right? Like agents are prone to hallucination, right? So if the confidence is missing, infer nothing. Set confidence to unknown. So basically, I'm kind of prompting the agent to say that keep your temperature low. Don't get creative about it. Like if Alex is having tea, don't give me a status report saying that Alex is probably going to have a cold because winter moving to summer now, right? Something like that, right? I'm just making this up. Make sure that the participants' names are not lost, right? So these are like facts, right? If no blockers are mentioned, set blockers to empty list. So don't be creative around that. So these are basically rules, and then we can tweak those rules as well, right? But what is going to help me tweak those rules is basically if I have something in like a JSON format which talks specifically. So I can also say like plain English, but it's then going to kind of these beasts are like token hungry. They're going to spit a lot of things, which they probably love talking, right? Agents love talking more than us. So possibly you want to limit what they want to give out, right? So that is where, I put this as a JSON. And then I looked at a lot of these transcripts and gave a little sets of hints of how to extract. So for those who cannot see this on like not on video, right? The extraction hints are basically parts of the transcripts which are like common. For example, accomplishments, today's focus, blockers, asks. and the date, which is in the date field. So these are things which are definitely going to be there, and these are what the hints that I'm trying to give to that particular agent. And then I take this entire thing and then put it into my agent instructions. So this being a no-code platform, I have put this instruction in, and then it's going to spin out an entire version of my agent with this as a system instruction, right? That's precisely what's going to happen. And then I just save this particular agent. So it's probably going to take some time to save it, but it is pointing to my source. So two things that I want to show is this entire system instruction is available in the behavior tab. I have also added the place where all my meeting recordings are available. And I have taken this specific status meeting, which happens every day in the morning. And then I have saved this agent. It's taken me like 10 to 20 minutes for saving this agent and then this being published. And then I have this published right here in my Copilot repository. So this is where we can say that, okay, we have created a meeting status agent. And
Right.
Fingers crossed, I'm going to test drive it. Hopefully it's not going to, bomb its way out of the world.
Well, may the power be with you.
Okay, so let's look at, let's start one thing. Let's look at what Alex, so there are multiple things that I can do with this, right? So I can summarize for everybody. I can summarize for one person. So let's try doing it for our gentleman here, who is Kevin, right? So summarize this week's status for Kevin. Well, I'm trying this out for the first time, right? So probably, we can tweak the agent and do stuff like that, but hopefully we'll discover something.
Yeah, I always knew that we are an honest pod, and that's what you're proving. So it's working.
Yeah. So then, it does do well on this. So basically it's saying what went well, what is the current focus areas, risk, dependency. I can also change it a little bit to summarize the entire pod. It also starts giving me, since it's an LLM, right? So that's why I said, right? It's also started giving me things that it has gone through. This is where things can go horribly wrong, because if you don't know this, it's probably going to suggest you things that you probably shouldn't be doing, or probably could not be more accurate, not as accurate as you want it to be, right? But can you summarize the status of the project? So see, we already kept guardrails saying that you should be very honest and stuff around that. So we believe the agent, right? So now let us say that what is it going to do after summarizing all of these, right? So
I can see the report now. Yeah.
So these are all the, so then it did give me a weekly status, but I don't know whether it did all of this also, right? So how many, we can ask more follow-up questions, right? So how many users, or how many developers, or let's say engineers?
I think you're trying to bring in citations, or you want to check the groundedness of what the output is, right?
Yes. Can you reference? Just to make sure that, I hope it does that. We'll have to probably then go back to the cycle of, tuning it and giving stuff around that. But it's still kind of thinking, right? So there are 9 engineers, which is right. And then it's looked at each of these. These are the role which is there. And then probably it's given me nice. Good enough for a status report is what.
Yeah, no, this is nice. It didn't take you very long to turn this around, isn't it? Although you did have some of this pre-prep, but it didn't take very long to do this. One quick question. So this is something that can be done through a prompt by prompt basis. You attach all the things on a LLM, you create a project, you put all the files there as source files, and then ask questions, and then it turns out a weekly report. But what you're saying is slightly more sophisticated. It is more institutionalized, in the sense that the agent has been created and metered and calibrated, and then you repeatedly use that without loss of context.
Yes. So that's basically what I initially said about, what are the engineering principles and guardrails which are there. So if you're expecting, look at it more like frameworks, but those frameworks are much more higher level, right? So you have like a guardrail around this, and then that guardrail is basically going to set up those engineering systems, and then those engineering systems are going to have processes around it. And then you need to have like those frameworks which people are going to use. And what I'm using is something that's available out of the box for anybody
Yeah.
who's like Copilot Studio and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean that Copilot Studio is the only one out there. You could use OpenAI. You could code this natively using cloud. Everything is more or less going to take the same amount of time.
And Ravi, would this be available to everyone in your team or everyone in your organization if you wanted it to be?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you could net publish it. So that is the other part of the guardrail, saying that if this goes through and this gets audited, you could then take this and then publish this to be available out of like an app repository, right? And there are a lot of these. So if you look at this here, available from, there are some that I have built on my own, but there are more of these which are available by Microsoft, and there are more of these which are kind of built by my org, which are kind of available for people to use right out of the box.
And that starts facilitating what is a powerful individual agent into actually an operating model shift, doesn't it? In terms of how everyone starts actually summarizing their meeting notes and doing their status reports.
Yeah,
That's quite an organizational step.
Yes.
And requires management and ensuring it's being controlled in an effective manner. I mean, it looks
Yes.
fantastic.
Yes. And a lot of these are like toys that we are talking about, but then you could apply it to very, very powerful scenarios like FHIR integration. Right? We were talking about law some time back with Srini offline, and I was thinking, okay, how about law transcription and stuff around that, right? I mean, you could probably use it for a lot of ways, which is where you can start thinking of, what could be guardrails. And as engineers, we are designed to think like, what could go wrong about all of these things.
And what are you seeing in that space? What does tend to go wrong? How are mistakes being made? Because obviously you've done it in a very disciplined way and it's had a great outcome. But when I do my first one, I'm not going to be so good at how I actually do my prompt. What is happening when people are experimenting with these things? What's not being achieved? What's not being done correctly?
So very, very much in the context of this example, if you write it differently, your status report will be very different than mine. And then we are all based on facts. So you could tell management that, hey, there is no risk. And my LLM could then tell that there is a risk. And it could even become more worse, right? So if I ask the same question to the LLM again, it's probably going to, think through and then say, okay, I said it was a risk, but it's not a risk anymore because of this and this reason. And then you don't know. So these are the guardrails. Right? These could do very much wrong. And think about it, if you're doing like adjudication or you're doing finance and stuff like that, that's where I say 40%, 50% of your time, this is a complicated problem right there. So how much time are you spending on?
We've always been brought up with AI to sort of have that human in the loop control and validation of what's happening. But as these agents become more sophisticated, they become more automated, and actually that human validation of the output is actually more and more limited. So actually there is an inherent risk being developed here, isn't there, in terms of great tools, great outcomes, but as they get better and better, we're doing less and less validation.
Yeah. And that's what I call like the occupational risk of using a very powerful tool, right? If I'm going to take this tool and then democratize it and then make it available across the entire organization and then say, hey, you run amok with it all through, then you have one of two outcomes, right? Either you have like a proliferation of like substandard tools which are going to kind of kill your organization, or the other way is like, if you're going to guardrail it, then basically you're so slow than your peers and competitors, and probably you're going to die. Right? So now what you really need is not everybody starting to do a guardrail, but what are the institutional frameworks that you have which are codified into engineering tooling that is available to you, right? And I can show some of these if you have time of what could be like guardrails. And some of these are like principles that you should define. It's basically like you need to make changes at all places. So we talk a little bit about leadership and stuff like that, but then you need to codify these guardrails in a lot of your engineering practices as well, in your engineering tooling as well. And some of these are already available, which you could kind of use and leverage, provided you know that there is a need for that to happen, right? Which is where there's a lot of gap in the industry.
Yeah. And if you're a senior leader and you've got responsibility for 100, 1,000 people, how do you sort of manage this? Do you give them the opportunity to play, encourage them to go and do these things and control perhaps the deployment aspect of it, or do you establish the validation and review processes and make sure that actually they can demonstrate that they've been through a testing process before these things are actually launched? Because it's how to sort of balance that excitement of all being able to do these new things without actually making something an endemic problem that could actually, if it hasn't been done properly, everyone's using, and you could have really quite scaled up issues.
Oh yeah,
How
absolutely.
do you controls aspect?
I think a lot of these controls are in terms of metrics, right? So I was talking through in terms of, like what could be like good metrics, right? So at the bare minimum, right? Like what is it that you want to define as a metric for this to reach folks, right? I mean, that's what you need to sit and define, right? So if I think through in terms of, let me just see if I have some. So these are like very bland metrics which I play around with, and then you can define it, right? So if I look at my metric, I will say, like, what is my quality metric? Is my quality metric like, if I have like a large amount of sets which are there, right? What is my accuracy versus resolution rate? I mean, you could define a lot of these metrics which would make sense for you, right? And then continuously measure those metrics. It's not very different from how it was for the ML world, because for the ML world, we always used to measure model drift against labeled data. So we need to have like a golden data set which says that, but then golden data set which talks about, okay, what is my quality metric which is there, right? But now with LLMs, you need to introduce newer kind of metrics, right, which I call like risk metrics, right? So there are some metrics over here which are already there and people know about them. So you could talk about adoption metrics, you could talk about efficiency metrics, which we have already been tracking, right? But the new metric that should be added is basically the risk metric, right? So that's not there at all. So take all these categories of metrics, and you could kind of, go crazy wild with it to define like what works for you based on, as Srini said earlier, right? The kind of organization that you are in, right? Like if you're a digital native versus like, like you are like a organization which is like traditional and stuff around that, right? And then define what are the metrics that make sense for you, and then continuously measure them. And that is where, you need to make changes at a principle level, you need to make change at a policy level, you need to make change at an engineering practice level, and then you need to make change at tooling level, right? So that entire chain needs to be kind of replicated for making this, trustable enough to be used in production.
True, very true. I think this kind of brought to life the issues that either a serious agentification that we might do, or even a less serious one, right? So I think the kind of considerations that you don't want to overboil the criteria and do complicated evals when you don't need to do, right? So I think that's what you're saying. Ravi, any giveaways, any interesting templates that you think we can give away to our listeners? Not maybe now, but we'll probably put some links somewhere in the show notes or etc. to allow our listeners to pick this and maybe try, get in touch with us, etc.
Yeah, absolutely, Srini. I think one thing that I'm very passionate about is, like as Leonardo da Vinci said, like simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, right?
Yes.
We can go overboard, but you need to have like a framework, right? So the one thing that I was thinking, and then I use it, I tried it out for myself, especially for building agents, and works with the theme that we are in today, right? How to automate like 70 to 80% of your work so that you can spend and give time back to ideation, right? So it's a 7-day plan. Can you take your agent? Can you define an agent for yourself and then define a 7-day plan for yourself to build agents, right? So let me kind of spend like 2 minutes to kind of walk through.
Yep.
What could be like a good plan? And this is something that I fashioned for myself so that I have like a framework for myself when I'm kind of building things, right? So let me share my screen again. So day one starts with, so building an agent is not like a big deal, or it could be a big deal based on those use cases, right? So there will be like certain modifications that need to happen. But what's really missed when we kind of build an agent is the steps which we take before we start working on an agent, right? Which starts with like problem and user clarity. And what's helped me when I do this is basically, if I have just one shot at making things successful, I would rather spend time and energy on the one that matters the most, right? So we do start it in a very structured manner. You start with something which says that, okay, this is my problem. And then I have some interesting thing which says that, hey, remove autoscope. So what do I don't want to build, right? I don't want to build, right? So you could build an agent for, since the barrier is so low, you could build an agent for anything. Well, that is the recipe for disaster, right? So spend a day to define your problem. Then after you take that problem, crystallize it further. You spend another day to say that what it will do, what it will not do. So that you can then define that, hey, this is what it will do. It's very, very purpose built, right? So these are like purpose built stuff which add value. And then the third day you spend to define what are your knowledge sources and what do you want, right? And I have this interesting thing which says what I'm not going to use, right? I'm not going to use customer data, right? So if somebody is going to talk about a subscription number or basically like, like a patient ID or stuff like that in my meeting notes, I don't want that to happen, right? These are like recipes for disaster. So spend a day to do that. Then spend another day to write your agent instructions. Right? What is your agent instructions? How do you want it? What are the safety and compliance instructions? So this safety and compliance is basically going to flow from disallowed knowledge sources. Right? So you need to kind of tie that back. So a lot of these kind of tie back to each other. So if you do it step by step, you will have like a good system drawn. And then we didn't talk about this a lot, but a lot of agents become more deterministic as you add like skills, tools, and actions. If you kind of do that is when what I think David talked about that as well in terms of responsible AI. So that's like the big bucket of things which are there. So you do want that agent to think on its own, but you also don't want it to think too much on its own, right? You also want you want to enable the agent to kind of reach disparate sources which you could never reach in the first place, right? Some of these are like code calling. Some of these are like SharePoint locations which are there in the context of what we are kind of trying to build today. And then last is basically like your test scenarios. And then we talked a little bit about the metrics as well, right? So you define what are your test scenarios, define what's your label data set. And then the last day, you kind of define whatever the metrics, right? So this is like a 7-day plan or a 7-day like a thought framework, which is there, right? You sit for 7 days, spend your 40% of your time defining these. And if you have like 20 of these proposals out there, then you pick the one that's best and then, have a way to kind of burn that proposal to the ground. And then you have something that works right in production that you are proud of.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about what you're saying is it's all about sharpening the axe. It's about making sure that you know what you're planning to build, because these, call them vibe coding tools, other responses, they're so fast and they can be really quickly turning around and showing you things. And then you are incrementally changing, going with it. But what you're saying is take your time to sharpen the axe, take your time to think through this, because this is going to be there and this is going to be repetitively used. This is going to become the institutional foundation, as it were, almost, right?
Yes.
So I think that point is very well taken. No, this is really useful. I think these templates, if we can share with our listeners, I think that will be fantastic, Ravi. And thank you for thinking through these. David, any thoughts before we kind of move towards wrap?
It's just such an exciting time, isn't it? Because there's such a myriad of different opportunities out there. Satya Nadella, who said that AI requires a sense of urgency and imagination. And I think that's so true, particularly when you start going into these agentic world and actually where and how you're going to use these different agents and different processes, different procedures is why there's so much engagement and so much activity. It's now a question of how you manage it and control it and get the outcomes, but it's an extraordinary period in history, isn't it?
Indeed.
Yeah. I think, So, sorry, I couldn't just resist adding, right? I think the other thing is, separate noise from signal, right? Like there's so much noise around there, right? You could possibly have so much noise that's raining you from all these recommendation feeds, and then they feed you back what you kind of tend to read more, right? So for all the viewers out there, make sure that even if you read, you're probably going to see more of what you read, right? So what you need to have a discerning ability to separate noise from signal and then take entire humanity to the next level, right? I mean, that's where we want to be. Right? I mean, nobody wants to be at a point where they didn't think about it and 20 years down the line, hey, we should have thought about it earlier, right? So it's very important to separate both of these out.
Absolutely. I think you've kind of ended on a very good note and very useful, Ravi, very useful in terms of what you covered today. And I'm waiting for a day when, we don't have to work and taxes will be zero. And, I don't want to call it UBI, universal basic, whatever income. But hopefully AI takes us one day to a point where we can all do pottery and sculpture and things like that. And then, the check comes in every day, every month, and we all watch Netflix movies. But that's some time away, and which is good. We still can sharpen our axes. On that note, really, thank you, David. Thanks, Ravi. Really enriching conversation. Can't believe we have spent an hour on this.
Yeah, time flies.
Yes, time flies. I'll let you go and catch up on the remaining part of the Sunday, but I wanted to thank both of you again. Ravi, you're not going anywhere. We're going to get you back and let's do some more of these interesting conversations, explore other nooks of actual hands-on work. And yeah, this is going to be fun, but thank you both.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you,
Thanks,
Srini.
Ravi.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.